It was a quiet afternoon in the small town of Maplewood, where life moved at an easy, familiar pace. The community center stood at the corner of Elm Street, a cheerful place that hosted everything from bake sales to music nights. That week, the center was buzzing with excitement because the annual Maplewood Talent Show was just around the corner. Everyone in town looked forward to it, not because it was professional or grand, but because it was fun, silly, and full of surprises. The talent show wasn't about winning prizes. It was about laughter and community. Teenagers practiced magic tricks, children rehearsed dance moves, and a few adults prepared songs or jokes. Among the list of names, however, one stood out: Mrs. Margaret Hill. Margaret was an elderly woman who lived alone on Rosewood Lane. She was well-liked but kept mostly to herself. People knew her as the sweet lady who fed stray cats and spent afternoons tending her rose garden. She wasn't known for singing, dancing, or performing, so when her name appeared on the sign-up sheet for the talent show, everyone was puzzled. Margaret Hill, singing? One of the volunteers asked with a laugh. "You're kidding, right?" The truth was, it had started as a joke. A few mischievous teenagers from the neighborhood, thinking it would be funny, had written her name on the participant list as a prank. They never expected her to actually attend. They imagined it would give everyone a good laugh during the introductions, an innocent bit of fun. When the list was printed and posted on the community bulletin board, people chuckled when they saw her name. "Oh, poor Margaret," someone said with a grin. "She probably doesn't even know she's on the list." But the story took an unexpected turn. 2 days before the event, Margaret received a polite call from the community center. The cheerful young organizer, not realizing the prank, thanked her for signing up and asked what song she planned to perform. For a moment, Margaret didn't know what to say. She was surprised, no, shocked. She hadn't signed up for anything. Her first instinct was to correct the mistake, but as she stood there with the phone in her hand, something inside her stirred. A memory, a feeling she hadn't touched in years. You see, long before she became Mrs. Hill, the quiet widow with the roses, Margaret had been someone else, Margaret Benson, a young woman with a dream of singing on stage. She had loved music more than anything. As a girl, she used to sing in the church choir, and her voice had once won a small-town competition. But life, as it often does, had other plans. She married young, raised children, and worked long hours at a factory to support her family. Her dream of singing faded into the background like a song half forgotten. So when that unexpected phone call came, she felt a spark, small, fragile, but alive. Maybe, she thought, it was time to do something she hadn't done in decades. Sing. That night, Margaret sat by her old wooden piano, which had gathered dust in the corner of her living room. Her fingers touched the keys gently. She hummed softly at first, her voice shaky and uncertain, but soon the melody began to flow and warm and familiar. She smiled to herself, remembering how good it felt to sing. The next day, she walked to the community center to confirm her participation. The staff was pleasantly surprised to see her. "Mrs. Hill." "We're so happy you'll be performing," they said. She nodded politely, her heart pounding. Word spread quickly through the small town. "Did you hear? Margaret Hill is actually going to sing at the talent show." The whispers carried a mix of amusement and curiosity. Some people couldn't wait to see what would happen. Others felt a bit guilty, realizing the sign-up had been a prank that now seemed to have taken on a life of its own. As the big night approached, Margaret prepared in her quiet way. She didn't have fancy clothes or backing tracks. She chose a simple song from her youth, one that reminded her of love, hope, and the passage of time. She practiced each evening standing by her window, singing softly into the night air. Neighbors walking by could sometimes hear her voice, gentle but clear, floating through the evening breeze. Meanwhile, the teenagers who started the joke felt uneasy. They hadn't meant to embarrass her. They planned to apologize after the show, hoping it wouldn't go too far. The day of the event arrived. The community center was packed. Laughter, chatter, and the smell of popcorn filled the air. Colorful banners hung from the ceiling, and a small stage was set up with fairy lights. Participants lined up backstage, nervous and excited. Margaret sat quietly in a corner, her wrinkled hands folded in her lap, a serene smile on her face. Nobody knew what to expect. Some thought she might read a poem or tell a story. A few whispered that she might sing something funny or old-fashioned. Nobody imagined what was about to happen, as the MC called her name. Next up, we have Mrs. Margaret Hill. Polite applause echoed through the hall. The teenagers exchanged awkward looks. Margaret rose slowly, adjusting her cardigan, and walked to the stage. Her steps were small but steady. At that moment, the laughter faded into silence. Something about her calm expression, the quiet dignity in her walk, made everyone pay attention. The joke that had started in jest was now turning into something unexpectedly meaningful. What began as a prank was becoming the start of something beautiful, a moment that would soon leave the entire audience speechless. The evening of the Maplewood talent show finally arrived. The community center, usually quiet and ordinary, sparkled with excitement. Fairy lights wrapped around wooden beams and rows of chairs filled the hall. The smell of fresh popcorn and hot chocolate floated through the air. Everyone in town had come to watch, parents, children, and even a few curious visitors from nearby neighborhoods. Laughter and chatter filled the room as people greeted each other. For a small town, this was their biggest night of the year. Every performer had someone cheering for them, except perhaps one. At exactly 7 o'clock, the first act began. A young boy performed a magic trick that made everyone giggle. A group of girls danced to a pop song, missing a few steps but smiling all the way. The audience clapped warmly for each one. Then, as the host read the next name, a hush fell over the crowd. "Next up," he announced, glancing at his card, "Mrs. Margaret Hill." For a moment there was silence. Then soft murmurs spread across the room. Some people leaned forward. Others exchanged amused looks. A few of the teenagers who had written her name as a joke lowered their heads, feeling a knot of guilt twist in their stomachs, and then through the side door, she appeared. Margaret Hill walked slowly toward the stage, wearing a simple blue dress and a small silver brooch shaped like a flower. Her hair was neatly tied back, and she held her hands together as if to steady herself. Her face carried both nervousness and grace, the kind of calm that comes from a lifetime of quiet strength. The room grew still. Even the children stopped fidgeting. There was something about her presence, gentle but dignified, that demanded respect without saying a word. The host helped her onto the stage, whispering encouragement. Margaret smiled and nodded. Her eyes scanned the crowd, faces she had known for years, neighbors, friends, and strangers all waiting to see what she would do. Someone whispered, "Is she really going to sing?" Another chuckled softly. "Oh, this should be interesting." Margaret took a deep breath. The microphone felt heavy in her hand. For a second, she thought about turning back. Her heart pounded in her chest and her palms felt cold. The bright lights made it hard to see the faces in the crowd, but she could feel their eyes on her, waiting, doubting, judging. But then she remembered something. The night before, she had stood by her window looking out at the stars, humming softly. She had promised herself that if she was brave enough to walk onto that stage, she would give it her heart, not to impress anyone, not to prove a point, but to feel alive again. So she stayed. The pianist gave her a reassuring nod and began to play the opening notes of her chosen song, a timeless ballad that once meant everything to her. The same song she used to sing to her late husband James when they were young and full of dreams. The first note trembled from her lips, soft and uncertain. A few people leaned closer to hear, and then something changed. Her voice grew steadier, stronger, warm and clear like a melody from another time. The whispers stopped. People who had been smirking now sat frozen, eyes wide. The teenagers who had laughed looked at each other in disbelief. It wasn't just that she could sing, and it was the emotion in her voice. Every word carried a lifetime of memories, love, loss, and quiet courage. In that moment, the community center was no longer just a small town hall. It became a place where time stood still. Margaret wasn't an old woman anymore. She was a young dreamer again, the girl who had once believed in music and love and possibilities. Her voice filled the room, wrapping around everyone like a gentle embrace. Some people smiled through tears. Others closed their eyes, letting the song take them somewhere far away. When she reached the final verse, she looked up, her eyes glistening under the soft lights. Her voice rose higher, stronger, carrying all the beauty and pain she had held inside for years. And when the last note echoed into silence, and for a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then, the applause came. Loud, powerful, unstoppable. The audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation. The sound of clapping filled the hall like a wave. People shouted her name. Some were crying, some were smiling, all were deeply moved. The host hurried back to the stage, visibly emotional. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice trembling slightly, "Mrs. Margaret Hill." Margaret stood there, tears in her eyes, a hand over her heart. She tried to speak but couldn't. The noise, the love, the sheer disbelief of the moment was overwhelming. She simply smiled. That quiet, humble smile that said everything words could not. In the corner of the room, the teenagers who had signed her up felt their throats tighten. One of them whispered, "We thought it would be funny, but she's incredible." Another nodded, wiping his eyes. "I think we just helped her find her dream again." When the applause finally faded, Margaret stepped off the stage, greeted by hugs and cheers. People thanked her, praised her, and told her how much her song had touched them. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen, not as the old lady from Rosewood Lane, but as Margaret the singer, the woman she had always been inside. And as she walked home under the soft glow of streetlights that night, she whispered to herself, maybe it wasn't such a joke after all. The next morning, the town of Maplewood was buzzing. People couldn't stop talking about Mrs. Margaret Hill, the quiet elderly woman who had walked onto the stage as a joke, but walked off as a star. Her performance had become the heartbeat of every conversation at the cafe, the grocery store, and even the schoolyard. But for Margaret, that night wasn't about fame. It was about something far deeper, a feeling she thought she'd lost long ago. When she woke up the next day, sunlight streaming through her lace curtains, she smiled quietly to herself. Her heart felt light, like she had just released years of silence into the world. Yet, behind her calm smile, she still couldn't believe it had really happened. She replayed the night in her mind. The lights, the applause, the tears in people's eyes. It all felt like a dream. She had expected laughter or awkward pity, not admiration and respect. The memory of that standing ovation warmed her heart like a soft fire on a cold day. Later that afternoon, a gentle knock came at her door. When she opened it, she found 3 teenagers standing nervously on her porch, the same boys who had added her name to the talent show list. One of them held a small bouquet of wildflowers picked clumsily from someone's garden. "Mrs. Hill," the tallest one began, his voice shaky. We wanted to say sorry, it was us. We signed you up as a joke. We didn't think you'd really do it." For a moment, Margaret just looked at them, her eyes soft and kind. Then she smiled. "Well," she said, her voice calm and gentle, "I suppose it was a good joke after all. It gave me the courage to sing again." The boys stared at her, surprised by her grace. She invited them in for tea, and they sat awkwardly at her old kitchen table while the smell of freshly baked bread filled the air. They listened as she told them stories about her younger days, how she used to sing in the church choir, how music once meant everything to her, and how life, little by little, had pulled her away from it. One of the boys asked softly, "Why did you stop singing?" Margaret paused, her eyes growing distant. "Because I thought nobody wanted to listen anymore," she said. "But last night I realized something. Maybe the music never left me. Maybe it was just waiting for me to find it again." The boys sat quietly, touched by her words. When they left, they promised her something, that they would never laugh at anyone's dreams again. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the community center called. The same host from the talent show wanted to invite Margaret to perform again, this time at the town's upcoming charity event. "Your song touched so many hearts," he said. "It would mean the world if you could sing again." Margaret hesitated. A part of her wanted to retreat back into her quiet life, but another part, the one that had been awakened, urged her to say yes. After a long pause, she finally whispered, "I would be honored." The following days were filled with preparation. Margaret decided to rehearse properly this time. She opened her old piano again and dusted off a small box of memories. Inside it were faded music sheets, old photos of her and James, and a worn-out silver locket he had given her when they were young. Inside the locket was a tiny photo of him and the words engraved, "Sing when you can't speak." Those words felt heavier now, more meaningful. It was as if her late husband was gently reminding her that her voice still mattered. She practiced every evening as twilight painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. Her voice, though aged, carried something no young singer could replicate: life. Every note had a story, every pause had a purpose. Her neighbors often stopped outside her window just to listen. One even recorded a short clip and shared it online, where it began spreading across social media. Comments poured in. This woman's voice gave me chills. You can feel her soul in every note. I don't even know her, but she made me cry without even trying. Margaret was touching hearts beyond Maplewood. When the night of the charity event arrived, she stood backstage again, nervous but not afraid. This time she wasn't singing to prove herself. She was singing to give something back, to remind everyone, young or old, that it's never too late to shine. As the lights dimmed and her name was announced, she closed her eyes and whispered softly, "This one's for you, James." The music began, and she walked onto the stage, the same small blue dress, the same calm smile, but this time there was no doubt, no hesitation, only grace. Her voice filled the hall once again, warm and beautiful, carrying a message that would linger in every listener's heart long after the last note faded. Dreams don't die. They just wait for us to remember them. When the final chord ended, the audience rose to their feet again, just as they had before. The applause was thunderous, but what Margaret heard most clearly wasn't the clapping. It was the quiet whisper in her heart that said, "You found your voice again." The evening of the charity concert arrived with a chill in the air and excitement that hummed softly through the town of Maplewood. The event was held in the same community center where Margaret Hill had stunned everyone weeks earlier. But this time things were different. The hall was full, not just of locals, but of visitors from nearby towns who had heard the story of the elderly woman with the golden voice. People whispered her name in admiration, some still not believing the tale. "She's the one, right? The woman who sang at the talent show." "Yes," another replied softly. "The one who made the whole town cry." Behind the stage curtain, Margaret sat quietly on a wooden chair. Her old blue dress was pressed neatly, and her silver brooch shone faintly under the lights. Her trembling hands held a folded piece of paper, the lyrics to the song she was about to sing. She didn't need them anymore. She had memorized every word, but somehow holding that paper gave her comfort, like holding on to an old friend. The muffled sounds of applause echoed from the other side of the curtain as the previous performer finished. Margaret took a deep breath. Her heart was racing, but it wasn't the same nervous fear she once felt. It was something else, a mix of excitement, hope, and quiet courage. The host peeked in and smiled warmly. "Mrs. Hill, are you ready?" She nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." He gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder and walked out to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice rang through the hall, "our next performer needs no introduction. Her voice has touched hearts across our town and beyond. Please welcome Mrs. Margaret Hill." The lights dimmed. A single spotlight illuminated the stage. The curtain opened slowly. For a few seconds, the crowd went silent. Margaret walked forward, steady but graceful, like someone carrying both wisdom and dreams in her steps. She stood before the microphone, her soft eyes scanning the faces in the audience. Young, old families and strangers all watching her with anticipation and respect. She could see the same teenagers sitting in the front row, the ones who had once written her name as a joke. Now they were her biggest supporters, holding handmade signs that read, "We love you, Mrs. Hill." The pianist nodded at her from the corner. The first gentle chords began, low, slow, and full of warmth. Margaret closed her eyes and then, she sang. The first note floated into the air, fragile but pure. The sound was soft, like a whisper at first, uncertain, delicate. But as the melody carried her forward, her voice grew stronger, richer, deeper. It was the kind of voice that didn't just reach ears. It reached hearts. Every person in that room felt something stir inside them. The music had a soul, and it spoke of everything Margaret had lived through. Love, loss, dreams forgotten, and dreams reborn. Her tone carried years of laughter and pain, yet it was filled with light. For Margaret, those first few moments were magical. She didn't see the crowd anymore. She didn't see the lights or hear the faint creak of chairs. She saw memories, the faces of her children when they were small, her husband smiling at her from across the old kitchen table, her younger self singing barefoot in a summer field. Each verse poured out of her like a story she had waited a lifetime to tell. The sound of her voice seemed to wrap around the audience like a warm embrace, pulling them into her world. Tears glistened in the eyes of strangers. A mother held her child's hand tighter. An old man in the back row wiped his glasses, pretending it was just the light making his eyes water. But everyone knew they weren't just hearing a song. They were witnessing a soul speaking through music. As the song built toward its climax, Margaret lifted her head and sang the line that had always meant the most to her, the one that reminded her of her husband's locket. When the world grows silent, sing from your heart. Her voice soared, strong, clear, and filled with love. It was as if time itself paused to listen. The pianist stopped playing, letting the last note linger. Margaret held the microphone close and let out the final note, long, beautiful, trembling with emotion. It hung in the air like the last petal of a flower falling to the ground. Then came silence. For a heartbeat, the world seemed still. And then, applause. Not just polite clapping, but thunderous, unstoppable applause that echoed through the hall like a storm of gratitude. People rose to their feet again, cheering her name. Some shouted, "Encore!" Others simply cried and clapped with all their hearts. Margaret stood there, her eyes shining with tears. She smiled. Not the shy, uncertain smile she once wore, but one full of joy and peace. She bowed her head slightly, whispering to herself, "Thank you." The host returned to the stage, visibly emotional. "Mrs. Hill," he said softly, "you didn't just sing tonight. You reminded us what it means to feel." As Margaret walked off the stage, the same teenagers rushed to hug her. "You're amazing," one of them said through tears. "We're so proud of you," she laughed gently. "You know," she said, "you boys gave me a gift without even realizing it." They looked at her curiously. "You reminded me that dreams don't fade," she said. "They just wait for the right moment to sing again." And as she stepped out into the cool night air, stars glittering above her, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in decades. Alive. The music still echoed in her heart, soft and eternal, as if the night itself was humming along. When Margaret Hill stepped off the stage that night, something inside her had changed, quietly but completely. She could feel it in her heartbeat, in her trembling hands, and the warmth of every tear she wiped away. It wasn't just that she had sung again. It was that she had become something she thought she had lost forever. Herself. The once timid woman who used to watch life from her window was gone. In her place stood a woman who had rediscovered her fire, gentle, but unbreakable. As she walked home under the glowing streetlights, the cool breeze brushed her face, carrying the faint echoes of applause still ringing in her ears. She smiled to herself, whispering softly, "I did it, James, I really did." The next morning, the entire town seemed different. People stopped her on the street, their faces bright with admiration. "Mrs. Hill, your song was beautiful," said a young mother pushing a stroller. "You made me cry," added an older man from the bakery. The same teenagers who once saw her as a joke now treated her like a hero. Margaret didn't quite know how to react to all the attention. She wasn't used to being noticed, but every kind word, every hug, and every thank you reminded her of something she had forgotten. Her life still mattered. She began to notice little things she had long overlooked. The laughter of children playing near her garden, the warmth of sunlight on her face, the sweet scent of her roses in full bloom. Everything felt brighter, alive again, as if the world itself had started singing along with her. But her transformation didn't stop there. That week, the community center called once more, not to invite her to perform, but to ask her something bigger. "Mrs. Hill," said the cheerful voice on the phone, "we're starting a small music group for seniors. Would you consider leading it? You've inspired so many people." Margaret hesitated, glancing at her piano by the window. "Me, a teacher?" she asked softly, almost laughing. "Yes, you," the woman on the phone said with a smile in her voice. "You've shown everyone that it's never too late to dream. We can't think of anyone better." After a long pause, Margaret said yes. The following Monday, she walked into the same community hall where her journey had begun. This time, she wasn't stepping onto the stage. She was standing in front of a group of seniors, some shy, some excited, all holding sheet music in trembling hands. At first, her voice quivered as she greeted them. "Good morning, everyone. I'm not sure I'm a real teacher," she said with a nervous laugh. "But I do know one thing. Music doesn't belong to the young. It belongs to the heart. The group smiled, nodding. And just like that, Margaret began teaching. Week by week, her small music circle grew. People came from nearby towns, retirees, widows, grandfathers, all drawn by the story of the woman who found her voice again. They didn't come just to sing. They came to feel alive, to share memories, to belong. Margaret would play her piano, guiding them patiently. Sometimes she'd stop and tell stories about her past, about the songs she used to love, the husband who encouraged her, and the moment she almost gave up. Each story touched someone's heart, making the room fill with laughter and tears in equal measure. Soon, people began calling their group the Second Chance Choir. They performed at nursing homes, schools, and community events. Every time they sang, the crowd listened with reverence. Margaret's voice would always lead the way, not the loudest, but the truest. Her story even caught the attention of a local reporter who came to interview her one afternoon. Sitting in her cozy living room, surrounded by framed photos and blooming roses, Margaret spoke humbly. "I never expected any of this," she said softly. "I thought my best days were behind me, but maybe they were just waiting for me to believe in them again." The reporter asked, "What gave you the courage to sing that night?" Margaret smiled thoughtfully. "A mistake," she said. "Someone signed me up as a joke, but maybe life knew I needed that little push. Sometimes miracles come disguised as pranks." The article was published a week later with the headline, "From a Joke to a Journey, the Woman Who Found Her Song Again." Her story spread quickly, reaching people far beyond Maplewood. Letters began arriving at her doorstep, from strangers, families, even other elderly singers who said her courage had inspired them to sing again, too. Margaret would read each one with tears in her eyes, whispering prayers of gratitude. It amazed her how one small moment, one accidental sign-up, had become a spark of hope for so many others. Every night, before going to bed, she would stand by her window looking up at the stars. The piano sat nearby, always ready, and sometimes when the world outside was silent, she would sit down and sing softly, not for applause, not for anyone to hear, but for herself. Each note was a reminder that transformation doesn't happen in a single night. It happens the moment you decide to stop being afraid. Margaret Hill had done exactly that. She had stepped out of her shadow and found her light again, and in doing so, she had taught everyone around her the most beautiful lesson of all. It's never too late to begin again. You just have to find the courage to sing your first note. The night of the grand charity gala arrived, the event that would mark a full circle in Margaret Hill's extraordinary journey. The town of Maplewood had never looked so alive. Fairy lights twinkled on every corner, soft music filled the air, and the community center, once just a small hall with creaky floors, now glowed like a stage meant for something truly special. This time, Margaret wasn't just performing for her town. Guests had come from nearby cities. Reporters with cameras waited near the doors, and people whispered her name with admiration and awe. "That's her," someone said softly. "The woman whose voice made the world stop for a moment." Inside, Margaret sat in the dressing room, calm but thoughtful. Her reflection in the mirror looked back at her. Older, yes, but radiant. Her hair was silver and shining under the light. Her eyes, though lined with years, sparkled with quiet confidence. On the table beside her was her late husband's silver locket. She held it gently, opening it to see the tiny photo and the engraved words inside. "Sing when you can't speak." She smiled, tears forming in her eyes. "You've been with me through it all, James," she whispered. "Tonight I'll sing for both of us." Outside, the sound of the crowd grew louder. The air was charged with anticipation. Everyone knew that this wasn't just another performance, and it was something far more meaningful. When her name was announced, the lights dimmed again and the room fell silent. The host's voice trembled slightly as he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the heart of our town, the woman who reminds us that dreams have no age, Mrs. Margaret Hill." The audience erupted into applause as she walked onto the stage. Dressed in an elegant navy gown with her brooch pinned near her heart, Margaret looked every bit like the legend she had become, though she carried herself with the same humility as always. She stepped up to the microphone, her hands steady now. The piano began to play softly behind her, the same melody she had sung at her first performance, but slower, deeper, richer. The crowd waited, breathless. Then Margaret began to sing. Her voice filled the hall, smooth and full of emotion, aged like fine wine. It wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. Every note carried truth, love, and something words could never fully express. She sang of youth and time, of love that endures and dreams that wait patiently to be found again. As the music swelled, the audience felt her story unfold within each verse. They could feel her joy, her loss, her rediscovery, every emotion wrapped in the melody like a ribbon of gold. And then came the final verse. Margaret took a deep breath. She looked up toward the ceiling lights which glowed like distant stars. Her fingers brushed lightly against her brooch. Her voice grew softer yet stronger at the same time, a sound that felt both fragile and eternal. As she reached the last line, her voice trembled, but not from fear, from emotion. She sang, "The song never ends, it just finds a new heart to carry on." And with that she held the final note. Long, pure, trembling with everything she had ever felt. The piano stopped. The note hung in the air like a heartbeat suspended in time. The entire room was still. No rustling, no whispers, not even a breath. It was as if the world itself was listening. Then, a single tear rolled down Margaret's cheek as she lowered the microphone. Silence. Then, thunder. The hall erupted in applause, roaring, echoing, unstoppable applause. People rose from their seats all at once, clapping until their palms stung. Some were crying openly. Others shouted her name. Cameras flashed, capturing the image of an elderly woman on stage, bathed in light, smiling through her tears. It wasn't just a performance. It was a miracle. The host joined her on stage, barely holding back emotion. "Mrs. Hill," he said softly into the microphone, "you've given us something beyond words tonight. You've reminded us all that music doesn't just come from the voice. It comes from the heart." Margaret looked out at the crowd, overwhelmed. "Thank you," she whispered. "You've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever." The audience clapped again, louder than before. The choir she had been teaching, the Second Chance Choir, stood in the back row, their eyes filled with pride. The boys who once teased her were there too, holding a banner that read, "Once a joke, now our inspiration." Margaret laughed softly, her heart glowing. She knew this was more than applause. It was love. It was life answering back to her music. Later that night, after the lights dimmed and the crowd had gone home, Margaret stood alone on the empty stage. The piano sat quietly, the microphone gleaming faintly in the dim light. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "This was my final note. But not my final song." She touched her locket one last time and smiled. The silence around her didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full of memories, full of music that would live on long after her voice faded. As she stepped off the stage and walked into the night, the stars above seemed to shine a little brighter, as if they, too, were applauding her. When the lights went out that night and the crowd's cheers finally faded into the cool evening air, Margaret Hill stood alone backstage, still trembling with emotion. The sound of applause still echoed in her heart, not as noise, but as something sacred, something she could feel deep in her bones. For a long moment she didn't move. The silver locket in her hand felt warm, almost alive. She pressed it gently against her chest and whispered, "We did it, James." It wasn't just a victory, it was a homecoming. When she finally stepped outside, the cold night greeted her softly. The moon hung low and bright, and the streets of Maplewood shimmered faintly from the evening dew. She took slow, quiet steps down the familiar path toward her home, her heels clicking gently against the pavement. She was tired, but it was the kind of exhaustion that came from joy, from finally fulfilling something you were meant to do. Halfway home, she noticed a small crowd waiting near her garden gate. At first she thought she was imagining things, but as she came closer she saw faces, familiar and new, all smiling, all holding candles, children, neighbors, and even strangers from nearby towns had gathered there, waiting for her return. The same teenagers who once played a prank on her now stood proudly in front, holding a handmade sign that said, "Thank you for reminding us to dream." When she reached them, they began to clap softly, not the loud, thunderous kind she'd heard on stage, but a warm, gentle applause, like a heartbeat of gratitude. One of the teenagers stepped forward, his eyes glossy with tears. "Mrs. Hill," he said quietly, "we're sorry for the joke. But if we hadn't done it, none of this would have happened. You changed everything, for us, for everyone." Margaret smiled and placed her wrinkled hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes," she said kindly, "a mistake can lead us exactly where we were meant to go." Someone handed her a bouquet of daisies, her favorite flowers. She thanked them softly, overwhelmed by the love surrounding her. For so many years she had lived quietly, almost invisibly, her days blending into one another. But now she realized people had seen her, truly seen her. Not as the old lady on Rosewood Lane, but as a woman who dared to dream again. They stayed with her that night, sitting on her porch, drinking tea and sharing stories. Margaret laughed, a deep, joyful laugh that seemed to echo all the way to the stars. For once her house didn't feel empty. It was alive with warmth and light. As the night grew late, the crowd began to leave one by one, each person hugging her tightly. Before the last group left, a young woman with a camera approached her. "Mrs. Hill," she said softly, "may I ask you something?" "Of course, dear," Margaret replied. The woman hesitated, then asked, "When you sang tonight, what were you thinking about?" Margaret looked up at the moon for a moment, her eyes shimmering. "I was thinking," she said slowly, "about how every person carries a song inside them, but most of us forget the words." "I remembered mine tonight." The young woman smiled, blinking away tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "That's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." The next morning, Margaret woke to something unexpected. Her phone, which usually stayed silent, was ringing nonstop. Her inbox was full of messages. Someone from the audience had posted a video of her performance online, and overnight it had gone viral. Millions of people had watched it. The clip of her standing on stage singing her heart out had spread across social media with captions like, "This woman's voice will make you cry. Proof that it's never too late to follow your dream." She sang, and the world listened. Reporters began calling her the voice of courage. Messages poured in from people across the world. A widower in Italy who said her song helped him heal, a young girl in India who said it gave her strength to sing again, and an elderly man in Canada who wrote, "You reminded me that I'm not too old to matter." Margaret read every single message, often through tears. Each one felt like a note in a larger song, a song that had started with her but now belonged to the world. Later that week, she was invited to appear on a national TV show to share her story. When the host asked her what she had learned through it all, she smiled and said, "I learned that sometimes life waits for you to be ready. And when you are, even the smallest whisper can become a song that the world hears." The audience clapped, but Margaret didn't crave the spotlight. What mattered to her most was knowing that her voice had touched hearts, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. That evening, when she returned home, she walked straight to her piano. The sun was setting, painting her living room golden. She sat down, placed her hands on the keys, and began to hum softly. No cameras, no crowd, just her and the fading light. Her voice was gentle, almost like a lullaby. She closed her eyes, smiling through tears. For years she had believed her story was over. But now she knew. It was only changing chapters. Outside her window, her roses swayed gently in the evening breeze. Inside, her song continued. Soft, endless, alive. And as the last note left her lips, Margaret Hill whispered to herself, "Maybe this is what it feels like to finally come home." Time moved gently in Maplewood after that magical night, like a song that slowed down but never truly ended. The town, once quiet and ordinary, now carried a special warmth in the air. People still talked about Mrs. Margaret Hill, the woman whose voice had awakened something far beyond music. Months had passed since her performance at the charity gala, yet her presence still lingered everywhere. In the laughter of the townspeople, in the little notes pinned to the community board that read, "Keep singing, no matter your age." And in the soft echo of her final note that seemed to hum through the streets whenever the wind blew. Margaret's video continued to spread across the internet. Millions watched it and thousands shared it with words like, "This made me cry," and "Hope sounds like her." It became more than a viral clip. It became a symbol. Schools played it during assemblies. Choir teachers showed it to their students. Nursing homes invited their residents to sing again, inspired by her courage. Margaret never sought fame. In fact, when reporters tried to visit Maplewood to interview her again, they found her right where she'd always been, in her small house on Rosewood Lane, watering her roses, humming softly under her breath. When asked about her newfound popularity, she would laugh gently and say, "Oh dear, I'm just someone who sang a little too late and a little too loud." But the truth was, her song had changed lives. Every Thursday, her Second Chance Choir continued to meet at the community center. The group had doubled in size. Seniors who had once been shy now sang with bright, fearless voices. They laughed, missed notes, and sometimes forgot lyrics, but none of it mattered. Margaret always told them, "A perfect song is one that's sung with heart, not perfection." One afternoon after practice, a young woman approached her. She had tears in her eyes and held a letter in her trembling hand. "Mrs. Hill," she said, "I wanted to thank you. My mother passed away last year and I haven't been able to sing since. But your video, it made me want to try again. You reminded me that music doesn't die, it just waits for us." Margaret took her hand and smiled softly. "Then don't wait anymore, dear. The world needs your song too." That evening, after everyone had gone home, Margaret stayed behind. She sat at the old piano in the corner, running her fingers lightly across the keys. The room was empty, but she could almost hear their voices echoing. The laughter, the small mistakes, the beauty of it all. Her heart was full. A few weeks later, the mayor of Maplewood invited her to a ceremony. She didn't know why, but she went anyway. When she arrived, she found the entire town gathered once again at the community center, the very place where everything had begun. The mayor stepped forward and smiled. "Mrs. Hill," he began, "on behalf of everyone here, we want to thank you. You reminded us of something simple yet powerful, that every voice matters no matter the age, no matter the past. You gave this town its heart back." He unveiled a small plaque on the wall. It read, "The Margaret Hill Stage for those who believe it's never too late to shine." The audience erupted into applause. Margaret stood there speechless, tears filling her eyes. For once, she didn't need to sing. The sound of love around her was music enough. That night after the celebration, she walked home slowly, the plaque still shining in her mind. Her roses greeted her at the gate, blooming proudly under the moonlight. She stood there for a long while, breathing in the scent of the flowers, feeling the cool breeze against her face. Inside her cozy home, she sat by the window with a cup of tea, her silver locket resting against her chest. She opened it once more, gazing at the tiny photograph of her husband. "James," she whispered softly, "I think I finally kept my promise." Outside, the night was peaceful. The wind carried faint sounds from the community center. Laughter, a piano, the soft murmur of a song being rehearsed. Her choir was still singing. Her story was still alive. A few months later, when the seasons changed and the roses bloomed brighter than ever, the choir gathered to perform a special tribute concert, Songs of Second Chances. Margaret, feeling a little frail that evening, chose not to sing but sat in the front row instead. She watched them proudly, her hands folded in her lap, her heart swelling with love. As they sang her favorite song, she smiled through tears. She could feel her husband there beside her, as if whispering, "You did beautifully, my love." The audience stood at the end, clapping just as they had years ago. And though Margaret didn't rise to bow, her eyes glistened with peace. She knew her music had gone on, not through fame, not through headlines, but through the hearts she had touched. In the weeks that followed, the world kept singing her story. And somewhere beyond the stars, perhaps a melody lingered, soft, eternal, full of grace, because some songs never truly end. They simply find new voices to keep them alive. And Margaret Hill's song, her courage, her kindness, her belief that it's never too late, became the melody that Maplewood would hum for generations to come.